Today we are going to explore one of the most extraordinary and little-known episodes of the European Middle Ages, an event that brings together politics, architecture, sanitation, and tragedy in a combination that defies the imagination, the Erfurt latrine disaster, which occurred in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire in the year 1184. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. There are places in the world whose stones carry memories that time cannot erase. Erfurt is one of those places. Situated in the valley of the Gera River, in the central region of what we know today as Germany, this city has traversed centuries of transformations, wars, epidemics, and revolutions. However, there is a chapter of its history that remains partially shrouded in the shadows of time, a chapter that, when brought to light, reveals not only the fragility of medieval constructions, but also the complexity of the power disputes that shaped 12th century Europe. To understand this chapter, one must step back in time and dive into a universe very different from our own, a universe of kings, emperors, archbishops, and nobles whose ambitions frequently clashed with violence and unpredictable consequences. In the 12th century, the Holy Roman Empire was one of the most vast and complex political entities in Western Christendom. Despite its grandiose name, the empire was neither holy in the strictly religious sense, nor Roman in the original geographical sense, nor properly a unified empire under an unquestionable central authority. In reality, it was an intricate confederation of more than 1,600 semi-autonomous territories, each ruled by princes, dukes, counts, bishops, and abbots, who possessed varying degrees of independence and power. Keeping this political mosaic together required extraordinary diplomatic skill from the emperors, allied with a constant readiness to use force when diplomacy failed. It was a delicate balance, frequently threatened by territorial disputes, personal rivalries, and conflicts between secular and ecclesiastical power. At the center of this monumental stage rose the figure of Frederick Barbarossa, one of the most notable rulers in all of medieval history. Born around 1123 as a member of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, Frederick ascended to the German throne in 1152 and was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 1155. His nickname, Barbarossa, which in Italian means red beard, referred to his physical trademark, a thick reddish beard that became a symbol of his imposing presence and his temperament, which was both energetic and calculating. Frederick was a man of action, forged in the military campaigns of Italy and the political clashes with the papacy, and he possessed an ambitious vision for the empire. He desired to restore the glory of the ancient Roman emperors, centralize power in the hands of the crown, and subject recalcitrant princes to imperial authority. Throughout his reign, Frederick undertook no fewer than 6 military expeditions to the Italian peninsula, facing resistance from the Lombard cities, organized in the so-called Lombard League, and waging a prolonged struggle with the papacy for political and religious supremacy in Europe. These campaigns consumed years of his life and vast resources of the empire, but they were not his only challenges. Within the German borders themselves, Frederick had to deal with the nobility, who constantly sought to expand their own domains and privileges at the expense of imperial power. Among all the nobles of the empire, none was as powerful as Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony and Bavaria, Frederick's own cousin. Henry belonged to the House of Welf, the rival family of the Hohenstaufens, and for 2 decades he maintained a strategic alliance with Barbarossa that benefited both sides. Frederick confirmed Henry as Duke of Saxony and also granted him the Duchy of Bavaria, making him the most powerful noble in the empire, second in importance only to the emperor himself. With these 2 vast duchies under his control, Henry the Lion built a true state within a state, expanding his territories to the north and east of Germany, founding cities, patronizing the arts, and consolidating a power base that rivaled that of the imperial sovereign himself. However, as so often happens in history, the alliance between Frederick and Henry did not survive the test of time and ambition. The decisive moment occurred in 1176, when Frederick, during his 5th campaign in Italy, faced the Lombard League at the Battle of Legnano and suffered a severe defeat. At that critical moment, the emperor had requested military support from Henry the Lion, who refused. Henry had demanded in exchange the imperial city of Goslar and its rich silver mines, a demand that Frederick considered unacceptable. Henry's refusal to provide aid to the emperor in his moment of need was seen as an unpardonable betrayal. Frederick never forgave him. Barbarossa's revenge was methodical and implacable. In 1180, taking advantage of the hostility that other German princes harbored against Henry, Frederick convened a court of bishops and princes that judged Henry in absentia. The court declared that imperial law prevailed over traditional German law and stripped Henry of all his lands and titles, declaring him an outlaw. Frederick then invaded Saxony with an imperial army to force his cousin to surrender. Henry's allies abandoned him one by one. Finally, in November 1181, Henry the Lion had no choice but to submit to Frederick's authority at an imperial diet held in the city of Erfurt itself at St. Peter's Church, located in the Petersburg citadel. It was in this same place, in this same building laden with history, that the destinies of dozens of nobles would cross a few years later, in circumstances that no one could have imagined. The fall of Henry the Lion had profound and lasting consequences for the balance of power within the empire. The vast territories that were previously under his control were redistributed among other nobles, generating a true reconfiguration of the political map of central Germany. New duchies were created, old borders were redrawn, and inevitably new disputes arose among those seeking to claim portions of the confiscated territories. The redistribution of Henry's lands planted the seeds of conflicts that would stretch for years, and which ultimately would lead to one of the most bizarre and tragic episodes in medieval history. Among the many disputes that emerged from this power vacuum, one stood out for its intensity and the caliber of those involved. On one side was Louis III, the Landgrave of Thuringia, a ruler known for his combative nature and his willingness to face any adversary who stood in his way. On the other side was Conrad of Wittelsbach, the Archbishop of Mainz, one of the most influential prelates in the entire empire, whose tenacity was proverbial. Conrad had been removed from the office of Archbishop in 1165, but he simply refused to accept this decision, continuing to claim the title until his rival died, and he could officially resume the position. He was a man of fierce obstinacy, who did not yield easily on any matter of power or prestige. The dispute between Louis and Conrad involved territorial issues, rights over revenues and jurisdiction. Although the exact details of the quarrel have been lost in historical records, it is likely that it concerned the usual matters of feudal politics: control of territories, the right to build castles, and the collection of taxes. For the men of that era, these issues represented the very essence of their power. Territory meant wealth, and wealth meant influence. As time passed, the conflict between the Landgrave and the Archbishop not only persisted but intensified. Tensions escalated to the point of threatening the stability of the entire region, and it became clear that external intervention would be necessary to prevent the dispute from degenerating into open violence. It was the kind of situation that required the mediation of the highest authority in the empire. And it was exactly at this point that history took an unexpected turn, bringing to the center of events a young man of only 18 years who carried on his shoulders the weight of one of the most important titles in Christendom. Henry VI, the young king of Germany, was a figure remarkably different from his father, the formidable Frederick Barbarossa. Born in the autumn of 1165 at the Walkow Palace in Nijmegen, Henry was the second son of the emperor and Beatrice I, Countess of Burgundy. While his father was described as a man of imposing physical presence, impressive actions, and an expansive temperament that inspired adoration in his subjects, Henry was pale and slender, with a quieter and more serious disposition. He was a solitary and resolute young man, with a character difficult to penetrate, who made his decisions based on weighted calculations and a political vision that was surprising in its maturity. The chronicler Alberic of Trois-Fontaines described him as a man distinguished by his gifts of knowledge, crowned by the flowers of eloquence, and versed in both canon law and Roman law. At only 4 years of age, Henry had been elected King of the Romans by his father's determination during a Hoftag held in Bamberg at Pentecost in 1169, being crowned on August 15th at Aachen Cathedral. Since then, he had been educated to rule. He accompanied his father on the Italian campaign from 1174 to 1176, where he was instructed by the scholar Godfrey of Viterbo and socialized with the Minnesingers, the troubadour poets of the German court, such as Friedrich von Hausen and Bligger von Steinach. Henry was fluent in Latin, a patron of the arts and poetry, and almost certainly composed at least one song himself, known as Kaiser Heinrich, Emperor Henry, preserved among the manuscripts of the Weingarten Songbook. In 1184, the same year in which the events of this narrative unfolded, Henry received his knightly investiture in a magnificent celebration held in Mainz. He was being prepared to assume full control of the empire, and his youth did not prevent him from already exercising considerable authority. When the dispute between Landgrave Louis III and Archbishop Conrad reached a critical point, Emperor Frederick Barbarossa decided that direct intervention from the crown was necessary. The young Henry VI was at that moment moving with his military forces on his way to Poland for a military campaign. His father ordered him to divert from his route and head to the city of Erfurt in Thuringia to mediate the situation between the two powerful rivals. It was a diplomatic mission of considerable importance, but one that the young king assumed with the determination characteristic of his personality. Erfurt was at that time one of the most significant cities in Thuringia and in all of central Germany. Mentioned for the first time in historical records in 724 as Erpesfurt, a name that alluded to the ford over the Gera River, the city had grown over the centuries to become an important commercial and religious center. Situated on the route of the Via Regia, the great medieval road that linked Eastern Europe to Galicia, Erfurt was a convergence point for merchants, pilgrims, clerics, and nobles. Its churches and monasteries dotted the urban landscape, and the imposing Petersburg citadel, built on a hill in the northwestern portion of the old city, dominated the horizon with its walls and towers. Inside the citadel, the Benedictine monastery of St. Peter and St. Paul, whose existence had been recorded since at least 1060, although it was likely even older, served as a center for religious life and, occasionally, as a site for imperial assemblies of great importance. The monastery church, rebuilt between 1103 and 1147 after a devastating fire in 1080, was a Romanesque-style building about 75 meters long, whose towers dominated the city skyline alongside the towers of Erfurt Cathedral and St. Severus's Church. It was in this setting that Henry VI decided to convene a Hoftag, a formal assembly of the imperial nobility, to resolve the dispute. The Hoftag was a central institution of the governance of the Holy Roman Empire, a kind of itinerant court in which the sovereign gathered princes, bishops, counts, and other nobles to deliberate on matters of importance to the empire. Unlike a formal imperial diet, the Hoftag was convened in a less protocol-heavy manner and frequently served as an instrument of mediation in conflicts between vassals. Henry scheduled the assembly for July 25, 1184, a date that coincided with the Feast of St. James, one of the most important celebrations on the medieval liturgical calendar. Henry's summons reverberated throughout the empire. Nobles from various regions answered the young king's call, aware that refusing a royal invitation could be interpreted as disloyalty or disrespect for the crown's authority. Counts, burgraves, bishops, and prominent citizens of Erfurt and neighboring regions began to converge on the city in the days preceding the assembly. Many arrived on July 25th, settling into the inns and residences available in the city. It was a gathering of considerable magnitude, attracting dozens of the most powerful and influential men in the empire. Among those who answered the summons were figures of prestige and noble lineage: Count Frederick Wess of Abenberg, Count Henry Vad of Schwarzburg, Count Gosmar III of Ziegenhain, accompanied by his brother-in-law, Burgrave Frederick Ved of Kirchberg, Count Burchard of Wartburg, and Beringer of Vellingen were among the most notable nobles present. Each of them represented a family with deep roots in the history of the empire, families whose names evoked centuries of military service, marriage alliances, and political rivalries. These men traveled to Erfurt in the expectation of participating in a diplomatic mediation, which, though important, seemed perfectly routine in the context of medieval imperial politics. None of them could have imagined that this trip would be their last. The exact location where the assembly met is a subject of debate among historians. Medieval sources agree that the meeting took place on the upper floor of a two-story building situated near Erfurt Cathedral, but they differ on whether this building was the provost's residence or the bishop's residence in the vicinity. Some accounts suggest that the meeting happened in the deanery of the Petersburg citadel within the complex of the monastery of St. Peter and St. Paul, the same location where Henry the Lion had submitted to Barbarossa 3 years earlier. Regardless of the precise location, all sources converge on one fundamental point. The building was old, and its supporting beams were made of wood. To understand the dimension of what was about to happen, it is necessary to understand how medieval constructions of the 12th century functioned. The engineering of the time, though ingenious within its limits, did not have the knowledge of structural calculation that modern science would provide centuries later. Medieval builders designed their buildings based on accumulated experience and empirical rules, passed down from generation to generation, not on mathematical analyses of tension, compression, and load distribution. A structure that worked perfectly for everyday residential use could prove dangerously inadequate when subjected to loads much higher than those anticipated in its original design. The wooden beams that supported the floor of the upper story of the building where the assembly would meet had aged considerably over the years. Wood, by its nature, is subject to progressive deterioration caused by humidity, insects, and the simple passage of time. Beams that were once robust and reliable could, over decades, lose much of their structural strength without this degradation being apparent to untrained eyes. The building probably continued to look solid and functional on the outside, but inside its entrails were compromised, corroded by a silent process of deterioration that had transformed the once firm wood into a fragile and brittle material. And there was another element in that construction that would prove to be of decisive importance. Beneath the ground floor of the building, there was a cesspit, a large underground cavity that served as a reservoir for the human waste produced by the building's latrines. The sanitation systems of medieval Europe were, by modern standards, extraordinarily primitive. Latrines basically consisted of sloping openings that led waste to underground pits, or in some cases, directly into moats or watercourses. In castles and monasteries, where constructions were more elaborate, latrines could be designed as structures protruding from the external walls, called garderobes, which allowed waste to fall by gravity into a pit at the base of the building. These pits were rarely emptied regularly, partly because the work of cleaning them was so unpleasant that few were willing to perform it. In large monasteries and citadels, the pits could reach considerable depths and accumulate immense amounts of decomposing organic matter over years or even decades. The content of these pits was particularly dangerous. The accumulated waste acquired a semi-liquid and dense consistency comparable to a kind of organic quicksand. The decomposition of organic matter generated toxic gases, and the mixture of excrement, urine, and water created a potentially lethal environment for anyone who fell into it. It was not just a matter of repugnance. Falling into a medieval cesspit was a death sentence. The depth of the material, its consistency, and the emanated gases made escape practically impossible without external help. Furthermore, many people in the Middle Ages did not know how to swim, which made the survival of anyone who ended up in that terrible environment even more unlikely. The morning of July 26, 1184, dawned like any other summer morning in Thuringia. The sun illuminated the towers of Erfurt Cathedral and the walls of the Petersburg citadel, and the city bustled with the excitement caused by the presence of so many nobles and their retinues. The preparations for the assembly were complete, and the participants began to head to the building designated for the meeting. Dozens of men, many of them wearing the heavy and elaborate garments that denoted their social status, climbed the stairs leading to the upper floor where the negotiations were to take place. The young King Henry VI took his place in a stone alcove by a window, a position that gave him both visibility and a certain physical separation from the rest of the participants. Archbishop Conrad of Mainz sat with him in this same alcove. Landgrave Louis III was somewhere in the room, surrounded by the counts, burgraves, and other nobles, whose names composed a true almanac of the 12th century aristocracy. The room filled progressively as more participants arrived and took their places. The wooden floor creaked under the weight of the men moving across it. Some people may have noticed the sound, may have felt the slight swaying of the boards under their feet, but they likely attributed these sensations to the normal characteristics of an old building. No one seemed to seriously consider the possibility that the floor might not support the load. And then, without any warning, the unimaginable happened. The combined weight of dozens of nobles, with their heavy clothing and their bodies concentrated in a relatively confined space, exceeded the load-bearing capacity of the rotted beams supporting the upper floor. With a terrible crash, the wooden floor gave way. The rupture was sudden and catastrophic. There was no time for reaction, no time for escape. In an instant, men who seconds before were sitting discussing matters of politics and territories saw the world literally collapse under their feet. Bodies, furniture, and debris plummeted from the second floor in a chaotic avalanche of splintered wood, screams, and dust. But the catastrophe did not end there. The violent impact of the bodies and rubble on the ground floor proved to be more than that second structure could support. The floor of the first level also gave way, unable to absorb the energy of the impact, and the weight suddenly dumped upon it. And it was in this second collapse that the tragedy reached its most terrible dimension. Beneath the ground floor lay the building's underground cesspit, that immense and deep reservoir of human waste accumulated over years. The nobles who survived the fall from the second floor and the collapse of the first level then found themselves precipitated into that dark and fetid cavity, plunging into the waste that filled the pit. The scene that followed was of indescribable horror. Men who a few moments before were figures of authority and prestige, whose names inspired respect and whose decisions shaped the destinies of entire communities, were now struggling in a semi-liquid mass of human excrement, surrounded by debris of wood and stone, in a partial darkness punctuated only by the desperate screams of their companions. Some died on the impact of the fall, their bodies crushed by the force of the collision with the lower structures or hit by heavy debris. Others died buried by the rubble that continued to fall on them. But many of those who survived the physical collapse of the structure met an even more terrible fate. Unable to escape the pit, not knowing how to swim, weakened by injuries, and suffocated by the toxic gases emanated by the decomposing waste, they slowly drowned in that repugnant substance. Estimates of the number of fatalities vary among historical sources. Most records indicate that about 60 people perished in the disaster, although some sources suggest that the real number may have approached 100. Regardless of the exact figure, it was a catastrophic loss for the nobility of the Holy Roman Empire. In a matter of seconds, dozens of the empire's most prominent families lost their patriarchs, their leaders, their representatives. The Chronicle of St. Peter of Erfurt, one of the most detailed primary sources on the event, recorded the names of some of the nobles who perished. Count Frederick Thien of Abenberg, Count Henry Thien of Schwarzburg, Count Gosmar III of Ziegenhain, Gosmar's brother-in-law Burgrave Frederick Thvaz of Kirchberg, Count Burchard of Wartburg, and Beringer of Vellingen. The chronicle also mentions, laconically, other lesser names that were not recorded, an indication that the list of victims was considerable and included figures whose importance was not sufficient to merit individual mention in the annals of history. While dozens of nobles met their death in the pit, 3 men survived the disaster, in circumstances that can be described as remarkable or even providential. King Henry VI and Archbishop Conrad of Mainz, sitting together in the stone alcove by the window, escaped the fall. The alcove, built of stone masonry and not wood like the rest of the floor, did not collapse when the floor around it gave way. The 2 men suddenly found themselves suspended over an abyss of rubble and horror, clinging to the iron bars of the window while the world crumbled around them. They remained in this precarious position, supported only by the strength of their arms and the solidity of the stone structure, until rescue teams managed to reach the site with ladders and pull them to safety. Landgrave Louis III curiously fell during the collapse. He was dragged down by the avalanche of bodies and debris and likely ended up in the pit itself or very close to it. Historical records do not specify exactly how he managed to escape, but he was rescued alive, presumably covered in filth but breathing. The fact that the 3 men at the center of the original dispute, the king who had convened the assembly and the 2 nobles whose quarrel had motivated the meeting, all survived while dozens of innocent participants died, constitutes one of the bitterest ironies of the entire episode. History sometimes seems endowed with a particularly dark sense of humor. The fate of the survivors of the disaster in the hours and days that followed remains largely unknown. Rescue efforts must have been tremendously difficult given the nature of the site and the extent of the destruction. Recovering the bodies of the dead from the pit must have been a task that challenged not only the physical capacity of the rescuers, but also their psychological endurance. What the sources record clearly is the reaction of the young king. Henry VI, having survived the collapse by a combination of luck and his choice of seat, did not remain in Erfurt to supervise the consequences of the disaster or to try to resolve the dispute that had motivated the assembly. Instead, he left Erfurt immediately and resumed his military campaign toward Poland, leaving the conflict between Louis and Conrad exactly as he had found it, unresolved. This abrupt departure may seem insensitive to modern eyes, but it must be understood in the context of the medieval mentality. For a 12th century king, the maintenance of military campaigns and strategic commitments was a matter of political survival. Henry likely considered that remaining in Erfurt, in a scene of devastation and death, could weaken his position and waste precious time needed for urgent military matters. The consequences of the disaster reverberated through the noble families of the empire during the years that followed. The sudden death of so many patriarchs and leaders triggered a series of hereditary successions that redrew the map of power in several regions. The inheritance of Count Henry I of Schwarzburg passed to his brother, Günther II. The legacy of Count Gosmar III of Ziegenhain was transmitted to his daughter, Luitgard, who would later marry Frederick, the brother of Landgrave Louis III himself, thus creating a marital connection between two families that had been on opposite sides of the tragedy. The inheritance of Burgrave Frederick I of Kirchberg passed to his son Henry, and the legacy of Count Burchard of Wartburg was transmitted to his son Louis. Each of these hereditary transmissions represented not only a change of power at the local level, but also a reconfiguration of the alliances and rivalries that defined the politics of the empire. As for the young King Henry VI, his life after the Erfurt latrine disaster took paths that would lead him to become one of the most powerful monarchs of medieval Europe. In 1186, he married Constance of Sicily, the posthumous daughter of King Roger II of Sicily, a union that would open the doors for him to the Sicilian crown and to an ambition for dominance that would extend across the Mediterranean. In 1190, his father, Frederick Barbarossa, drowned while trying to cross the Salef River during the Third Crusade, and Henry assumed full control of the empire. In 1191, he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Celestine III, and in 1194 he conquered the Kingdom of Sicily, becoming the sovereign of one of the vastest domains in Christendom. In one of the most notable episodes of his reign, Henry held as prisoner Richard the Lionheart himself, the King of England who had been captured during his return from the Third Crusade and obtained an extraordinary ransom for his release. Henry VI died in 1197, probably of malaria, at 32 years of age, leaving as heir his son Frederick, who would become Frederick II, one of the most fascinating emperors in medieval history. The Erfurt latrine disaster, despite its grotesque and shocking nature, received relatively little attention in the historical records of the time. It is possible that Henry VI himself preferred that the episode be discreetly forgotten, since the narrative of a king who almost drowned in excrement would hardly contribute to the construction of an image of imperial power and dignity. Few chroniclers dedicated more than a few lines to the event, and the information that has reached us is fragmentary and in some points contradictory. This scarcity of documentation is in itself revealing. In an era when chroniclers recorded in detail battles, coronations, marriages, and deaths of important figures, the relative silence surrounding the disaster suggests a deliberate effort to minimize an episode that was both devastating and deeply embarrassing for the imperial nobility. Over the centuries, however, the story of the Erfurt latrine collapse did not disappear. On the contrary, it migrated from formal historical records to the fertile ground of local folklore, where it was transformed and adapted in the way communities tell and retell their stories. In the German oral tradition, the event acquired legendary contours that gradually distanced themselves from documented historical facts, incorporating fictional elements and reinterpretations that reflected the values and interests of the storytellers. The most notable of these folkloric reinterpretations was recorded in the 19th century by the German writer and compiler Ludwig Bechstein, who included a version of the story in his Deutsches Sagenbuch, German legend book, published in 1853. Bechstein's narrative focuses on the figure of Henry of Schwarzburg, whom he erroneously refers to as Henry VII, and presents details that differ significantly from the historical record. In Bechstein's version, Henry of Schwarzburg was a man who had the habit of using a peculiar expression. Whenever he was confronted with a proposal he considered absurd or dishonorable, he would say something like, "If I did that, may I drown in the latrine." The cruel irony of this expression, given how Henry actually died, constitutes the core of the folkloric narrative, which presents his death as a kind of poetic justice or the involuntary fulfillment of a self-imposed prophecy. Bechstein's version differs from the historical record on several significant points. Frederick of Abenberg is erroneously identified as Frederick of Arnsberg. Gosmar of Ziegenhain is split into two distinct people, Gosmar of Hesse and Godfrey of Ziegenhain. The Hoftag is called a Reichstag, a term that designated a different and more formal type of imperial assembly. The location of the event is identified as the Benedictine monastery of St. Peter and St. Paul, where an imperial diet had indeed been held in 1181, but the collapse is described as a fall into a sewer rather than a cesspit. These discrepancies are understandable in light of the natural process of oral transmission, in which details are altered, simplified, or embellished over generations to make the story more memorable, more dramatic, or better suited to the audience's expectations. Over the centuries, some misconceptions have crystallized around the event. One of the most persistent is the idea that all the victims of the disaster died exclusively by drowning in the cesspit. While this is certainly the most spectacular and memorable dimension of the tragedy, and the one that gives it its unique character in history, the reality is that the causes of death were diverse. Some perished as a result of injuries sustained during the fall, hit by debris, or crushed by the impact. Others were buried by the mass of rubble that accumulated in the pit, and still others succumbed to asphyxiation caused by the toxic gases released by the decomposing waste, without necessarily having drowned in the semi-liquid material. The diversity of the causes of death, however, was progressively obscured by the more dramatic and more shocking narrative of collective drowning in excrement, which ended up dominating the popular memory of the event. The Erfurt latrine disaster, beyond its macabre and almost unbelievable aspect, offers a revealing window into the understanding of fundamental aspects of medieval life that are often ignored or underestimated in conventional historical narratives. The event illuminates, first of all, the issue of sanitation and infrastructure in medieval cities and buildings. Although the builders of the time were capable of erecting magnificent cathedrals and impressive fortresses, the sanitary conditions even in the most prestigious buildings were, by today's standards, alarmingly precarious. The coexistence of spaces of power and political deliberation with poorly maintained and potentially lethal cesspits is a blunt reminder that the distance between the grandeur of medieval ceremonies and the misery of their everyday infrastructure could have fatal consequences. Secondly, the disaster reveals the vulnerability that even the most powerful faced in the face of the technological limitations of their time. No armor, no political alliance, and no title of nobility could protect those nobles against the structural failure of a building whose beams were rotted. The tragedy equalized kings and counts, archbishops and knights, reducing them all to the same condition of vulnerability before a danger that no one had foreseen. Thirdly, the event offers a reflection on the unpredictable nature of history. The assembly convened by Henry VI was a routine procedure in the governance of the empire. Nothing in the apparent circumstances of that July day suggested that something extraordinary was about to happen. The disaster arose from a convergence of mundane factors: aged beams, excess weight, a poorly positioned pit, which individually were banal, but which combined produced a devastating catastrophe. It is the kind of event that reminds us that history is not made only of great plans and deliberate decisions, but also of accidents and unexpected failures that can alter the course of events. The city of Erfurt continued its trajectory through the following centuries. In the early 13th century, it became more independent with the founding of its own municipal council. Its university, founded in 1379, was the first to be established in the territory that constitutes modern Germany. Centuries later, a young student named Martin Luther would attend this university before triggering the Protestant Reformation. The Petersburg citadel, which witnessed the disaster of 1184, continued to be used throughout the centuries, serving as a military installation until 1963. After German reunification in 1990, a broad restoration project was initiated, transforming the citadel into a historical site open to the public. The Erfurt latrine disaster remains, almost 900 years after its occurrence, as one of the most singular and disturbing episodes of European medieval history. It confronts us with the fragility of the human condition and with the irony that the most powerful can be brought down not by enemy armies or palace conspiracies, but by something as prosaic as a rotted wooden floor over a neglected pit. It is a story that challenges our tendency to romanticize the Middle Ages, reminding us that behind the gleaming armor, the heraldic coats of arms, and the adorned audience halls, there existed a daily reality of precariousness, risk, and limitations that affected everyone without distinction of title or wealth. The nobles who died on that July day of 1184 in Erfurt were for the most part forgotten by history. Their names survive only in fragmentary chronicles and in genealogical lists consulted by specialists. But the way they died, that remained in the collective memory, transforming into legend, folklore, and eventually an object of study for historians seeking to understand not only the great events that shaped Western civilization, but also the small disasters, the forgotten accidents, and the unexpected tragedies that, together, compose the complex and often surprising fabric of the human experience. The story of the Erfurt latrine disaster teaches us that no building is stronger than its foundations, that no power is more secure than the infrastructure that supports it, and that, however grandiose our plans and our ambitions may be, we are all, ultimately, subject to the same laws of gravity, physics, and unpredictability that govern the material world. It is a lesson that crosses the centuries and remains as relevant today as it was on that summer morning in the heart of Thuringia, when the ground gave way under the feet of 60 nobles and the course of dozens of families was altered forever in a matter of seconds. And so, just as the stones of Erfurt keep the marks of centuries of history, we hope that this narrative has left its mark on you. If this journey through the past has awakened your curiosity, if you felt the weight of that moment in 1184 and the fragility it reveals about us all, then become part of our community. Subscribe to the channel to follow more narratives like this. Leave your comment sharing what caught your attention most in this episode, and don't forget to like the content, because each interaction helps us continue bringing to you the most extraordinary, surprising, and revealing chapters of human history. Because history never stops teaching us, and we never stop telling it.